It's always interesting sitting during these public practice weeks, or just whenever we have a new group that we're engaging, relating with. We don't have the same context that at least some of us here, some of us new participating during this public practice week, that those who are joining us from this most recent or from previous boot camps have. So it's always interesting deciding on a place of where to start, right? And it is a decision. No matter how much of analysis you do, you can never externalize the responsibility for that decision onto anything other than, well, any reason, right? Any substantial reason. But I guess I'll just lay it out here that today we're really just talking about our ability or lack of ability to notice that moment when we attempt to leave, reject what is here. It's funny, a lot of the teachings that I come across, right? A lot of the genuine Dharma talks about how, well, besides the Buddha nature teachings, right? But talk about how you're only ever recognizing the way in which things have always been. That's why in CC we often frame it, at least initially, as this is a training to reassociate with the totality of ourselves, or to reclaim the parts of ourselves that we reject. Right? Like we don't really emphasize shadow work so much, but it's not that we reject it at all, or in any case, it's an unavoidable aspect of the path. Some more prominent for some of us, less for others. It depends on your karma. Right? But even when we're doing that shadow work, we're engaging with our shadow. Like, it's not something apart from yourself. And in a very real sense, where we reject ourselves is where we then reject, well, the present moment. Is what fundamentally obscures us from this presence. And the being that way, the way we are, the mode of being of that, is the condition for what we call suffering to arise. But I think it's more accurate to say that our mode of being, how we are participating, establishes the conditions for various emergent qualities of experience. And it just so happens that being that way, where we reject ourselves, which is no different from rejecting reality, is the conditions for this emergent quality that we call suffering. That's often, I think, why suffering is associated with like this sense of friction or resistance. I think I've read a translation, one of the translations for dukkha as actually being, what is it? It's when you have a wheel and the hub where the axle is, where that it turns around, there's a lot of friction, resistance. It doesn't spin smoothly. Mm. Yeah, and so suffering is, I think, a good, maybe common ground for us to investigate this together. Like, what are these conditions besides, all the things that we typically read when we study Dharma, right? It's like ignorance. Ignorance is the root of suffering, right? It's not that that's perhaps wrong. It still holds true even in what I'm describing. Ignorance being something like the ignoring, which actually is a choice, but we don't see the way in which we are making a lot of the choices we are making. That's actually what it means to be, to be like karma, right? We don't see the way that we are perpetuating the occurrence of this seemingly, I don't know, like the wheel of samsara. Like we're perpetuating the conditions through which we become through, because we don't see the choices that we're making. We don't see how we are participating, right? I don't know if this is conceptually hard to understand, but essentially what I'm saying is the kind of hinge point through which there can be the conditions for suffering to arise are not, it's not about what we are being, but how we are being. Right? And the relationship between the two. Like what I am being, in a sense, right? We can give it, we can put a name to the form, we can label it and distinguish it. And that's a big thing. We have to distinguish it, right? Like distinguishing me as however you're distinguishing me right now, right? The guy on the screen who's talking at me, or somebody that I'm in transmission with, or Taylor, you know me by my name, right? And like that's who I am to you in this moment, which is a decision, because your representation of me could never capture the totality of what I am, right? And so it's not about the whether you distinguish me as Taylor, as a husband, a father, a son, a brother, a coworker, a boss, whatever the case may be. It's not being any of those things that is the problem. If that were the case, if we were to say the cessation of suffering is to not, I don't know, exist, or be something right? Like it's in the mistaking of these functional distinctions as ontological realities, truly existent ontologies. But before I talk about that a bit, it's, this notion of distinguishing, right? Or I'll speak to that, how it's a choice, right? You and I may walk into a room together, and there's a indeterminate energy of the space, right? That's typically what people call like the vibe of the room, the vibe, yeah. But depending on how we relate to that energetic signature, right, we may distinguish it as anxiety or excitement. Same energetic signature, but how we then stand in relation to it, because that determines how we are oriented in the space, then literally how we perceive, which itself is already conditioned by the prior moment. Right? That's what it means to, like, karma, like to be in samsara. You don't recognize the way that the prior moment has already conditioned the following moment. And we like lay it out in a sequence so that we can understand, right? So that we can build this conceptual framework and understand what is occurring. But samsara is described as beginningless because every distinction of a point of entry is not the truly existent beginning. That's what makes it beginningless and endless. Because we don't see the choices that we are making or how we are making the choices that perpetuate our karma, our being a certain way that is not apart from the reality that we inhabit, which has this emergent quality of suffering. And this isn't to say this is this mechanism that I'm describing is not inherently a problem, right? It is just the functional mechanism of how we exist, how mind renders reality. Which is why I was saying earlier, it's if we have the belief that the cessation of suffering is to, I don't know, not exist. I mean, like some sort of like a nihilistic view of like you have to abide in a sort of cessation that we enter through our meditation practice, where there's like just void. Well, that's not the case, right? Like, if anything, we've like if like the sutras and tantras that were written and what have you taught by fully completed realized beings is like the precision of distinctions is, for lack of a better word, magical, right? If anything, you only get more precise, right? But I guess you could say the problem, insofar as we're saying suffering is a problem, right? Suffering not being inherently a problem. Like, to call suffering an inherent problem with the implication that it shouldn't exist is itself to reject a part of reality, to reject our own suffering. Which is why, like, I don't know, what is his name? Longchenpa. I was reading some Longchenpa a little while ago, and like the text I was reading, like the first 2 chapters, is just him talking about like look at your suffering. You are suffering. Do you realize this? Like, this is your precious opportunity to do something about it. Right? But it's only in distinguishing it as a problem, not ultimately, but in that distinction of this is a problem, how we are being is a problem, being a different way, removing ourselves from being this way that is problematic, being differently is how we create a distinction, how we generate a path for change. And I guess this is where we could really get into that topic of today about noticing the moment where we reject experience. I think to do that, maybe we should understand a little bit just about our own practice of what does it even mean to be absorbed, right? I think we build these associations of, again, we make these distinctions. I am not absorbed. I need to develop my practice so that I can enter these absorptive states. And these absorptive states I associate with certain qualities, right? Hmm. I don't know, is maybe it's not obvious, right? But it's like we are never not absorbed into our experience. We're always absorbed into the reality that we are rendering. And that absorption, the reality that we are absorbed into, based upon the mode of being, mode of how we are participating, that creates the architecture of that render, either has the conditions for there to be this quality of suffering or not. Mm. This mechanism I was describing, like I said, it's not inherently a problem. It's just how we well, it's how, I don't even know what the right word for this is, because it's like it's how we exist. It's how mind is. Mind is not rendering some truly existent object. Right? It's like in order for us to have even gotten to this point, to have this conversation, to have these musings on the nature of mind, right? You needed to survive. And so that kind of survival karma, the karma of a biological organism, the desire to survive, is one of the strongest desires that we have. And that desire is not necessarily concerned with what is, but what works. And so when we enter a space, when you and I enter that room together, and there's that indeterminate energy, that could be either anxiousness, anxiety, or excitement, how we are conditioned to relate to that is dependent upon what has worked for us up until that point. Not the actuality of what is, but what has worked, what satisfies that desire of survival. And there are, I don't know, an indeterminate amount of desires that we, you could say, possess, that make up, that we are constituted, that is, makes up the constitution, the constituent energies of our being, right? And this is where we get into why we reject that rejection and suppression, how it's not ultimately a problem, but sets the conditions, contributes to the conditions for the arising of this suffering. Like if you just take that thought a bit further, right? This desire to survive. Well, part of the conditions of us being human beings, the frame, the reality of being a human, completely different reality than other beings inhabit, but the reality of being a human, to survive in that reality, right, is to survive together. But your uniqueness, what makes you unique, which we can describe it as our dispositions, our preferences, are different. But we must coexist. We also have this desire to coexist. Not just to coexist, but to live in community. And in order to cohere the uniqueness, right, there is a unifying, a generation of mutual agreement structures. This is the same thing I'm describing at various layers of reality, fractal layers of reality that we see. So on the seeming, right, I'm an individual, you're an individual, on the collective scale in that way, we generate these mutual agreement structures that then morals and ethics are situated atop, so that we distinguish this is good, this is bad, this is of value, this is the thing of ultimate value. And in order to, aspire or live in alignment with that, we deem these things as good as these things as bad. And that's different culture to culture, right? And so, very much so, we then have to functionally, it might be, sure, suppression and rejection, right? Because we don't know how to integrate those aspects of ourselves into the world, into that collective agreement structure, so we suppress it. And so on the collective scale, it's like in order for that society as its own collective nominal entity, the one culture, the one tribe, it takes on this collective unified identity. I'm an American. And we do the same. I'm Taylor. And that's all mixed up. And it becomes insisted upon, right? Because we don't always, we want to be, right? I think that's how LLMs work, right? You have a conversation with it and it doesn't remember all the nuance of the conversation. It paraphrases and summarizes and holds on to these higher level abstractions, its takeaways of what happened, what the conversation was about, right? For efficiency's sake. We don't always want to have to, when we enter a room, like see all the frames of what everything could be. We don't have the fitness to rest into that indeterminacy, that uncertainty, right? Because from the perspective of a being, from the perspective of order, that kind of chaos is death, right? We are here because what has worked. And so we build these referential maps, these functional representational maps, models of reality. And back to what we started with, the problem isn't what that is or what we are being, but how we insist that this is what reality ought to be in this moment. And so then, even when we come into this sit, we can see this phenomena. You might have had an idea of how this was going to go, how I should be talking to you. And if this doesn't match that, all of a sudden I'm distracted. Thoughts about the momentum of the day leading up to this point, what I need to do after this. We don't see how we have decided upon the necessary conditions for me to engage the moment wholly. But do we notice that exit? And so, a lot of our training, when we first start off as practitioners, right, it's this discipline of absorption. where we distinguish this ordinary, everyday mode of being as not absorbed. But actually, we are already absorbed into a mind that is fragmented. It's fragmented because in that insistence, in that refusal to participate in a reality that is not aligned with my idea, my representation of what this should be, we reject reality as is. We refuse to be present. And to go back to that, doing what works. Yeah, that can be quite exhausting, right? Because we never feel that we can just rest. There's always some condition that is not being met in order for us to rest. And so our initial steps as a practitioner, right, to train in this discipline of absorption is to cultivate these relative conditions, right? Quiet room, quiet space. And even then, we find it difficult to just rest that insistence, caught by the momentum of the day, worried about what comes next. And you can see the trajectory this may take a practitioner, right? Where it's like, I can only ever just rest in the nature of mind when my life has been pacified. And even that, we have an idea of what that looks like. And if it's not that, we can't rest. We don't allow ourselves to rest. The type of meditative stability that we seek becomes, well, it's quite fragile. It's our realization then is conditioned by ourselves. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite exhausting. Trying to hold it all together. That insistence of what this moment needs to be in order for us to rest. Well, that creates the vehicle for us to make these exit maneuvers from the moment. We insist upon a sense of substantial continuity, some ground of orientation that we can lean on. Right, so if this sit isn't what you expect it to be, or that date wasn't what you expected it to be, you can never just rest into that moment. There's always a restlessness And as practitioners, we can only ever see that when there are the means, the conditions for the feedback, which is why we have to live our lives. Insofar as we're not going to go live in a monastery. But that's why those initial months, years that we spend cultivating this quality of absorption through the discipline of absorption. Well, we develop this skill to be able to recognize the movement of our attention when it reaches for that exit. There are aspects to the present moment that we would rather not make contact with. Like that restlessness. Attention moving, seeking a place to land to satisfy that restlessness. Which is why the advice of the only way through it is so true. We have to go through this reassociative process. Because we hold this continuity, this narrative continuity of being, right? Our idea of who we are, what we should be doing, what this is. And all of that is an insistence that attempts to unify the various compartmentalized aspects of our lives. Right? When I'm at school, I show up in this way because I'm a student. When I'm at work, I show up in this way because I'm an employee. When I'm on the cushion, I show up as a good practitioner. Each with their own story that we then unify of the story of me as a story of me. We generate a role to play. And this is the same mechanism when we come into these sits and we have an idea of this is what a good sit should look like. We take those metrics of measurement that we have to make in order to, progress, to learn, to develop, and we laminate the association of those markers. We make them the point rather than what is cultivated. And so through this training of absorption, we start to see the way that how we are relating these mental, cognitive objects of the world, the story that we are a part of, subject and object. Where we attempt to hold that all together. Our attention is the guide. The object of our attention acts as an anchor. Which is why in our practices, perhaps we've used the breath, perhaps we've used metta, that acts as an anchor for this energy that we call desire. the energy of how we become falls into this gravity well of our attention. And so when we hold these representations, we insist upon these particular representations. That is the direction through which we become. And we insist upon that into contrast to what is not that. We insist into this direction of this is where my life should go, this is what this session should be, and when what we are experiencing is not that, we make adjustments, all in accordance to this aim. But exactly, it is an aim. Whereas self-empty realization is aimlessness. And so that's why maybe you've noticed that these transmissions aren't about giving instructions. But can you recognize that pull on attention that is already happening? It's the nature of being conditioned beings, having karma, our attention, which directs the way that we become, what we become, is already being pulled. And it feels as if it is distracted when another desire attempts to hook it. This is the phenomena, I think the kids call it, like we need to lock in, right? Lock in on your life. Like we have an idea of what our life is. We lock into that. We don't allow anything to distract us. But what that just means is that like we are investing into the construction of something specific that would need to then fundamentally reject anything other. And so then we are participating in a way where the conditions for us to simply rest, to allow our attention to settle onto the totality of how we are being in this moment is never met. You can start to see the kind of dilemma that a practitioner in the modern day finds himself in. Because if we have this teleos, this directional assumption, well, that the path is somewhere other than the conditions of my life, the conditions, the relationships through which this kind of feedback becomes available of where I am rejecting myself, my expression, my being. Those are the conditions you can find in a monastery, but even there they have rules, so it's not entirely, you can't entirely escape this insofar as there's I don't know anything that you exist. So far as you don't abide in some sort of cessation or Can you rest that insistence? Let the moment be anything other than it is, how it is appearing. Can you recognize the moment? You attempt to reject that, to leave the moment, to assert something else. So let's sit.